This content is brought to you by Uphold, which is a great platform that makes it easy and simple for you to buy, hold, and sell and earn crypto. You can trade from anything to anything. For example, you can trade between cryptocurrencies and precious metals. It's an amazing platform that I've been using for years. And in fact, I still use to this day because they're one, a great exchange, they're reputable, and they're one of the only exchanges that still lists XRP. Many of the other exchanges have delisted XRP due to the SEC lawsuit, but you can still get XRP on Uphold. So I've interviewed the CEO, the founder, and many other representatives from Uphold over the years, and I'm a fan of this platform. And once again, there's some great features like trading between different assets very easily. You don't have to convert to a currency and so forth. They're used by 10 plus million users. They have over 200 cryptocurrencies. And they have a very easy to use app. The interface is really nice. So I can certainly vouch for this platform. Once again, I've been a user for years. So if you'd like to learn more about Uphold, please visit the link in the description. Welcome back to the Thinking Crypto podcast, your home for cryptocurrency news and interviews. With me today is Sean Ford, who's the CEO of Algorand. Sean, great to have you back on the show.
Thanks, Tony. It's good to be back.
Sean, for everybody listening, I'm a big Algorand fan. I hold the Algo token, and there's been some big updates on your end, and I would love to discuss those things with you. One that I was reading about is the protocol upgrade, which boosted performance by 5x. Tell us about this upgrade and the benefits.
Yeah, so so stepping back, I mean, one of the things that we've always committed to is continuing to try to improve the performance of the layer one protocol, largely to do a few things. One, we know that with appropriate innovation and improvements to the blockchain itself, it's going to just open up greater opportunities for adoption, in particular by traditional industries or businesses that are looking to move into a more Web3 or a digital environment. And as you know, traditional companies and traditional businesses, governments tend not to be the most biggest risk takers or first movers with new tech. So anything you can do to remove any barriers around adoption or people feeling that they can move in and trust a new piece of technology, relatively new piece of technology, that's a good thing. And so one of the first big upgrades was the transactions per second on the Algorand blockchain went from around 1,100 transactions per second to 6,000. I think a little bit more than 6,000 per second. I believe that's where it's performing now. Took a couple weeks for the changes to propagate globally, but I think it's there. And so that's an important one, one, because you're now at a processing power that's significantly higher than a lot of credit card networks and on a global basis at peak capacity. So that's a nice hurdle. But I would say that the thing that we're most proud of is around the definition of TPS, or if we're talking about the 6,000 transactions per second, how we define it, and that's that that all transactions are final within the block. So this sort of sub 4 second block, 3.5 second block, and 6,000 transactions per second mean that there's no looking back in time to verify if something is correct. There's no waiting an hour to go back and verify if something is correct, or 15 minutes in the case of, say, Ethereum. You've got the same sort of performance you saw with Algorand before, that in that 3.5 seconds, you have full and complete finality of the transaction in that block. And then with the additional processing, speed that we have, obviously it makes it very attractive to traditional industries and businesses moving in. I'm only making this point because I think there's just a lot of intentional sort of differences of how this is defined and what TPS means. I would also say that this is for any transaction on the Algorand blockchain. It isn't for messages that are created by the chain itself to sort of pump up numbers and make it look faster than it is. This is not restrained by the type of transaction or the size of the transaction. So that's a pretty exciting thing because people trade real things. They don't just send messages. The second piece to the upgrade is state proofs. And so Algorand state proofs, there's a paper that was written about it a good, I don't know if it was 2 years ago, about implementing and the concept behind it. And I say that because there's been some recent chatter around where these originated, but Algorand's paper a couple years ago had some pretty clear ideas that in a future world where interoperability became more and more important, and making that, again, removing the friction of interoperability is something that we think would promote broad adoption, and really not just for Algorand, but for the industry and for all protocols. And so instead of having a centralized bridge that you build and purpose build from one environment to another, Algorand has created something that essentially allows a way to verify the state of the Algorand blockchain and create a trustless infrastructure that allows any other blockchain to be able to validate the state one versus the other without having to build a dedicated centralized bridge or a validator network. So, this is done through a light client, and it's just a simple interface that lets this interoperability happen where you verify the state. Ultimately in the future, there'll be, ZK snarks that are used, pactify the state, and then it will validate any other chain. And so again, it's trustless, and it removes that centralization that's so endemic to interoperability in the space today.
Yeah, I mean, just a great update on your end, and I'm curious if you could take us beyond the curtain with just amazing benefits that Algorand has versus, let's say, an Ethereum, which is still struggling. They just did the merge, with transactions per second, gas fees, and so forth, and Algorand being very energy efficient. How are institutions looking to Algorand? Are they kind of knocking your door like, okay, we want to explore this and we want to test this out?
Yeah, what we've seen is a fair bit of traction in just the migration from Web 2 to Web 3 at the highest level. And remember, again, if you believe the following, that a lot of times businesses will, especially ones that have a certain operating system, they're very reluctant to change because obviously there's risks associated with it, and if something is nascent and blockchain is still, I think, in a fairly nascent state, that risk is perceived to be higher and higher. And so I think, again, what we've seen, Algorand checks a bunch of the boxes for traditional businesses to feel like they're able to they have the confidence to step in and actually begin to implement blockchain solutions. And those are, things I'm sure, Tony, you've heard of. I won't go into detail, but, that Algorand is a green, really pioneered the whole idea of sustainability and being green as a requirement to ongoing value and adoption. That we have, really focused on our uptime and our sort of bulletproof performance with, again, zero downtime since we've launched the original version of the protocol in June of 2019. So that's a fairly, you might say that should be a standard metric, but it's certainly, you can look around, not characteristic of other chains that maybe have spent more on marketing. I think that the third thing is that with this transaction per second and the finality associated with it, people start to see that they don't have to compromise or in any way degrade the end user experience of their existing infrastructure or people there to be able to adopt the new technology. And I think that that lastly, you've got a situation where Algorand's performance starts to make it easier for people to see what's familiar and sort of step in and know that they're with a forward-leaning, innovative partner as we've continued to release and make improvements to the tech. So that's a long answer. The short answer is, yeah, we have a bunch of companies because of those, check boxes and our low transaction fees. It's much easier for them, to get over the hump and say, well, let's do a quick analysis. Oh, well, there's a chain that seems to be operating incredibly well, and I feel safe stepping in and either beginning something significant or starting to build applications or assets.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there was a big partnership done with regards to, I believe it was NFTs. It was FIFA plus Collect. Can you tell us about that partnership?
Sure. So I would say that, FIFA as an organization has made a commitment to, this is, I think, what they've said is really being a part of the future, in terms of how tech is adopted and used. And we're fortunate enough to have been selected as their partner around the FIFA Plus Collect marketplace. That was announced in a couple of weeks ago, I believe, and the statement there, I think, publicly was that it'll be available later this month or sometime this month. So it's an exciting time, because if you look, a lot of sports organizations broadly, the easiest place for them to begin is in the NFT and collectible space. And if they have a valuable access to certain assets that have various uses, typically they fall into the fact that it's a collectible space, and the NFT space is a start. And so we're fortunate to be the blockchain that's helped underpin all of that and help FIFA create this FIFA Plus Collect market that I think part of the selection for us was for the reasons I articulated earlier: performant, trustworthy, always available, low cost, all of those things. And so FIFA is the first of, I think, many sports organizations that are starting to move into the space more aggressively to do things beyond just NFTs, but launch other types of digital assets that could involve any number of different applications.
Yeah, I mean, just a huge partnership and certainly a big community behind the FIFA brand. Are there any other partnerships that you want to highlight? I know you guys, I couldn't even keep up this year because it was a lot. Any other major partnerships you think are?
Well, yeah, I think if you frame, I always get asked, like, where's Algorand focusing its time? Yeah. We see a lot of activity in sports, a lot of activity in gaming, and a lot in music. If you think about, some of the big highlights, I would say, one is we're a lead partner with Napster. The idea there is, I mean, first of all, I always get, people say, I didn't know Napster was still around, or Napster, that's really cool. Very few people go, I've never heard of Napster. So, Napster is a really interesting platform on which we can integrate a bunch of things we've learned in the broader sort of blockchain ecosystem space to be able to really convert Napster from something that would be, just purely music streaming to something that becomes a broader series of digital assets for musicians and creators to be able to go to and experience, all obviously built on blockchain and leveraging the capabilities there. So that's a fairly big partnership. And pretty important to us in terms of thinking about how to disrupt music. If you look at a number of games and gaming companies, Playground Labs with drone racing is actually going to be issuing their first version of their game in that sort of Web3 blockchain based environment using assets. You see a lot of uptake on the gaming front, top to bottom, and as you can imagine, gaming, music, and sports are in many ways the Venn diagrams overlap and they're converging, and so we're seeing a fair bit of action there. And then obviously on the sports side, there's a number of leagues and partners that we've been talking to. FIFA's at the top of that list. I do think that if you look at some traditional financial institutions, some announcement that came out, Bank of Italy did a fairly significant amount of work around evaluating different protocols. And what they're looking to do is, instead of thinking about how do you just shift everything to blockchain. The focus there from the paper they wrote, where I think they mentioned Algorand, over 100 times, is one where how do you leverage blockchain and take some of the benefits and make it interoperable with existing infrastructures, either leveraging the DLT aspect of it or the payment processing aspect of it. And that's particularly compelling for a lot of governments and banks that are looking to really do upgrades and still be relevant in a digital world, while not compromising again on the safety and security that they've come to expect in a more traditional setting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was really excited about the Napster and LimeWire partnerships you guys did, because I remember in the early days of the internet using those platforms. I'm not implicating myself here. I won't say what I did, but you're breathing new life into those companies, and it's amazing to see them reinvent themselves a bit and adopting Web3 tech. So right. Really, really cool. Right. I have to ask you about central bank digital currencies, because we've talked about it in the past. I know there's not much you can say there, but I'm curious, how have the pilots for CBDCs been going on Algorand? Any hints or clues you can give us?
I would say, this is going to be I'm just going to name a less satisfying answer, because I think I get asked this quite a lot. It's not that there's a lack of desire to sort of share, as much as we can. Of course, any company, not just in a blockchain space, wants to do that. You just don't hold the decision rights, and in many cases, you can do all the work, and then it runs into a series of either policies or timing or assessments that are done around when and how, and you get how that things shift in that world fairly quickly. So we are still engaged. I did, mention the Bank of Italy. That is not a trivial thing. They are at the middle of Europe, not geographically, but really around policymaking. So that's a fairly significant bank as it relates to the European Central Bank, the ECB. And so there's, I would say that's a promising paper that they published around a bunch of the work that's been done there. There's a number of other countries that we're engaged with, that are later stage in terms of developing, I'd say products and or working with us to leverage our technology appropriately. I would say, this is not a hint, be clear, but there was an announcement by the government of Nigeria that's working with our Latin American partner, Koi Banks, that is building a number of different things on top of, with Koi Banks, but on top of Algorand. So having these, governmental relationships, people often go, right, if they hear government, they go to CBDC. It's not always that. I think CBDC becomes an umbrella for a lot of different types of assets, probably not fairly, but it does. And there's a lot of conversations going on in different ways, and the different countries can leverage the benefits of blockchain without necessarily issuing a digital form of their currency.
So with that, Sean, I'm going to ask, would that be like bonds or certain types of financial services or products?
Sure. So ironically, sports organizations, even as just cool or somewhat orthogonal, everyone's looking at doing things like that. If you're talking to, a sports league or an organization, they could issue a bond, and that bond could be used to, help upgrade the facilities or fields of, youth facilities or youth fields across a country, backed on a bond that's issued, in a very interesting and sort of effective way on a blockchain. Reg A securities, other sort of regulated assets are being discussed. And so, yes, there's a whole bunch of, and that can be done at a national level, a state or city level. There's a lot of municipalities that are investigating these types of things. And I would just say that it's, again, sounds very easy, and technically it's actually not very hard, but you get into, different environments where when you're doing it the right way, it takes longer than you'd like, than just fire off, some bond coin, and then all of a sudden there's nothing to it, and that doesn't help anybody.
Absolutely. And I know governments themselves, they're not they don't move quick. They move very slow, and there's always a lot of red tape.
Yeah.
So we're in the bear market. It's crypto winter. How has Algorand been navigating? And I'm assuming you guys are heads down, just building.
Yeah, we're heads down building. I would say that there's been quite a bit of work. I mean, obviously, the tech that we discussed at the beginning of this conversation didn't, start yesterday. So there's been a lot of work that continues on making sure that we're continuing to innovate and build. I think that if you look, and I can't speak for the foundation, but you see the foundation has done a number of interesting things under Stacey Warden's leadership. They've brought in some I think incredibly talented people. That's good for the broader ecosystem. We're just a tech company, but they are really looking at continuing to invest in helping the community on board and adopt the technology, and that's a real positive thing. We've seen good momentum. And again, I'm a broken record, so everyone's going to give me a hard time, but from the very beginning, we have been long-term focused and focused on enduring value. So, markets come and go, but we are, we're not really focused on, I mean, I hate to say it, we're just really not focused on that. And I think, and I've said this before, and I'll end with it, is that over time, as more traditional businesses come into the space, and that could be adoption of crypto, from like BlackRock and starting things there, or it could be not just that, but also adopting the actual technology as traditional businesses come in. They bring with them, some slower movement, a slower execution cycle, but they bring with them exponentially more rigor and expectation. And what that ultimately does is it puts pressure on people who've maybe optimized their position in the market based on pure marketing and headlines, sort of sizzle versus steak. And I think we at Algorand have been like, we have to build this for where we think the market's ultimately going, and that is going to be a place where traditional businesses adopt. And I kind of feel like we're at a point where that force is starting to cross with what Algorand is bringing, and I think that's why we're seeing so much activity around the conversion from Web 2 to Web 3 from those industries.
Now, recently, Anthony Scaramucci, I've interviewed him a few times. I know he's a big Algo investor, and he wrote a book.
He did.
What are your thoughts about the book? And what are you coming with your book, by the way?
What am I going to do my book? Well, I think I was great he did it. I mean, it's one of those things where I think it's easy for people that are in the space like you and myself and other people. It's easy to forget how intractable this space is.
Yeah.
I mean, if you go back to the start of the internet, nobody knew what the hell was going on.
Right.
And even right now, I mean, does anyone really know how their ISP works? Like, who is it and what's going on? I mean, it's just, I'm sure there are. But my point is, the vast majority of people have no idea, and they just use apps, and they just want the app to work. Yes. So why am I saying this in the context of the book? I think that, Anthony does a good job of writing a book that individuals that have no idea about blockchain or Algorand can quickly get through and feel like they at least can ask some questions. I don't think Anthony would say it's a dissertation. That wasn't the intent. It was more mainstream, basic understanding. And really, I think he does a nice job of pointing out all of the advantages that Algorand brings to bear, and hopefully makes it something that people can feel a little bit smarter about what's actually going on at the company in the space.
Yeah. I got a copy, so I'm almost done reading it. And like you said, though, you and I are like chest deep into this. We get it, but there's a lot of people, they don't understand the tech. And
I don't think ZK snarks is in there, or polymorphic or homomorphic encryption or lattice-based cryptography. That's not the point of the book, right? It's like, here's what a blockchain is, and here's what Algorand does.
Absolutely. Let's talk about the crypto market at large. Lots happening on the crypto regulations front in the United States. We had President Biden's crypto executive order earlier this year. We see the crypto reports are coming in. We had a report just last week from the White House about crypto regulations. We had Senator Gillibrand, a Lummis bill. Lots happening. What are your thoughts, and do you feel we're moving in the right direction?
So a couple of thoughts. One is we are in favor of any sort of regulation that encourages an accelerated innovation environment. Yeah. So, I mean, that's a broad statement, but we need regulation and clarity around that enables people to feel confident that they can adopt and build on in this technology and in this environment. And I think that's a pretty consistent statement. Like, let's please focus on innovation and let's not do anything that hinders it, because the United States is should be a leader in that innovation, and not that any other country can't claim it as well. I think there's room for plenty of people and plenty of countries, but the point is that I think the U.S., we've got resources, we've got the sort of skill base to be able to do that, and I think that's one thing. The second thing is, if you're going to take a positive view of all this, is that I think a lot of people are trying to figure out, we talked about the technology being hard to understand. I think it's hard for governments, it's hard for institutions to understand, it's hard for businesses to understand. So there's different ways to go about understanding, and I think there's a big process to try to figure this out, which is coming at it in different ways and creates different responses and different, either allays fears or creates fears, depending on where you are. I think the last thing on this front is that our perspective again is one on just building really good technology, and the nice thing here is that as institutional investments and institutional companies come into the space, this is the tone has changed from, there's no we want to get rid of discussions that we're hearing. Right. It's really, we want to understand. And to us, if you go back 4 or 5 years, it wasn't always that way. Yeah. The only thing I would add finally is that in order to understand, it's going to take people that are involved in that process to let go of maybe some of the high level statements of 3 and 4 years ago and really focus on what's happening in the market today. Example number one being, good blockchain technology is green technology. Yeah. It's green. It is not the old narrative on Bitcoin being and Ethereum being energy inefficient. It is very different, and a lot of times people have trouble letting go of those themes and really sort of digging in and understanding where things are today.
Yeah, certainly seeing a shift in focus and narratives too around that, and I think the landscape is certainly changing. And I think for thinking technology that, for example, like Algorand and the things that you guys are doing. I know you touched on some of this, but what can we expect for the remainder of 2022 and also into 2023? Any other items on your roadblock? Roadblock.
Yep. I think we're gonna continue to push forward on taking advantage of the potential that state proofs bring, and driving towards interoperability. I think that there's going to be, considerable investments across the ecosystem around bringing developers, now that we've got I think a pretty robust community of folks, making it easier for developers to build and adopt with using various languages on Algorand. That's a big step. I think that certainly driving through on additional partnership activations that highlight the migration from Web 2 to Web 3. We talked about FIFA, talk about making Napster incredibly successful, and really pushing into innovative ways that businesses can start to use blockchain to disrupt old industries, which is really always the vision. That's what we're, I think, really going to see. There's a few other things on the tech roadmap that I'm not going to share now, but we're excited about, because we're always pushing ahead. And by the way, we've continued to hire in the market we're in, and we've got a really, really good and very, very strong engineering and product team and research team here that we're proud of, and that we're not just keeping around because everybody likes to look at them. It's like, let's get some work done and continue to push ahead.
That's exciting. Well, we're going to have you back on as those technical updates are pushed out. Final question here for you: if you could create your own metaverse, what would the theme be?
My own metaverse, what would the theme be? I think that's a great question. I think I would probably go with something like let's do the like the Old West. Let's go in like a Westworld type of a situation without all the horror that it ended up turning into. I mean, I love like I talked about. I know we'd shared this before, Tony, but it's like look, I love riding horses. It's a lot of fun. The big outdoors, going and I like the idea of everybody's in the middle of a lot of anxiety in the existing environment that we're in. It'd be nice to go somewhere where people kind of relax a little bit.
Oh, sure.
But I don't know how I would execute on that. But that's my off the cuff response.
Love it. No, to your point, getting out in nature, right? Escaping the anxiety and the tech. It's good to take a break and it
is.
Yeah. Sean, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh my gosh, thank you for having me.